Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is Don Walters. I serve as President and CEO of CFTC, and we're pleased to have you join us for our next session in the Compliance Fundamentals Training Conference, which will be the State Insurance Regulatory Examination Process and its impact upon compliance. To conduct our session today, we are honored and very pleased to have with us Tate Flott, who serves as the Chief of Market Regulation with the Kansas Insurance Department, and Mary Tresniak, who serves as Vice President and Head of Insurance Compliance at Transamerica. Make sure, there we are. Tate, Mary, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate the opportunity.
You are welcome. All right, let's begin our session today. We have two polling questions for you. And as you can see on the screen, the small icon to the right of your presentation is where you can provide your response to this survey question. And your responses are anonymous. And if you do submit your response, you'll be able to see the poll results through your virtual attendee hub. So our first question is this, just to get a sense of our audience. Many areas of an insurance company can be involved with a regulatory examination. What area best describes your role? Go ahead and take a few moments to answer.
We've got a few responses. Let's give it a little bit longer.
Sure.
Okay, I would say most are saying compliance. And then we've got a few in legal and operations or business.
Okay, very well. All right, Mallory, thank you very much. That's helpful. So as we would anticipate, most of our audience is comprised of compliance professionals, which makes sense. However, it's interesting to note that we have people from legal departments here and also from operations. And as we talked about yesterday, we are seeing a trend where more and more people from operations are joining compliance. So that's a wonderful development. All right, our second question is the following. What is your level of insurance regulatory examination experience? So either you do not have experience in this area, you've supported an insurance regulatory examination, or you have led or co-led an insurance regulatory examination. Please go ahead and vote.
We're still getting responses. We've gotten a little bit of all, but A and B are tied. So I think the majority have said I have supported an insurance regulatory examination.
And that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, because in order to be able to respond to an insurance regulatory examination, it's a team effort. It may be led by one or two individuals, but for the most part, it clearly is a team effort, and the representatives at the company work together to try to provide the accurate and appropriate responses to the requests that they're being received by from regulators. Okay, very well. All right, so if you have a question during this session, you can submit it through the Q&A button that's at the right of your presentation content on your screen. We'll monitor the questions as they come in. We'd be happy to try and answer them to the extent we are able to do so. So we welcome your submission of questions. So let's go ahead and get underway. Our agenda today is really going to be focused on two specific areas. First, we'd like to begin with having Tate share the regulator perspective on the market conduct examination process. And then we'll have an opportunity for Mary to share the company perspective. And we think this is important really in several respects. Number one, we'd like to educate you as to the key elements of the regulatory examination process, and Tate will assist us in providing that information. But we also think it's important for you as compliance professionals with life insurance companies to understand the role and the challenges that you may face in terms of trying to provide this type of information that is requested as an appropriate request for regulatory examination and oversight purposes. It's a very important function to keep the marketplace safe and sound. So with that, let's begin with the regulatory perspective. And Tate, let me turn to you, if I may, and ask you if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts as to what is the role of market conduct. We know it certainly is designed to make sure that The marketplace is going to be fair for all participants, certainly to protect consumers. But how do you see the market conduct process, Tate, as being an important part of your role as a regulator?
Yeah, well, thanks, Don. I'm happy to be here with you and Mary. So I think just to sort of level set, basically, the role of market conduct is to assess our marketplace to not only ensure that consumers are protected, but also to make sure that there's a level playing field for insurers. And ultimately, we are out constantly reviewing our marketplace, as other states are, to make sure that there are no concerns. So there are often, reviews we do where something may appear to be an issue, but upon, further analysis or review, we determine that, there's an explanation for it and really no further action is necessary. But it really is just keeping a pulse on our marketplace. And, we have a variety of sources that we'll touch on later that we rely on to do our reviews and our analysis. But, ultimately, first and foremost, our priority is to make sure that our consumers are protected. And when we see issues that appear to be harming our consumers, we try to be as proactive as possible. But when that's not an option, then we use one of our tools to make sure that if there are deficiencies, they're corrected and that they're not repeated. So really, we always approach things first and foremost as, okay, how do we make our consumers whole? And yes, there may be penalties and things like that down the road, but our first priority is always making sure that consumers are protected in our marketplace.
Yeah, and that's a very, very important role, Tate, and thank you for sharing that perspective. And, from a CFTC viewpoint, we look at our organization as one that has an opportunity to bring regulators and industry representatives together to talk about these types of issues, because really overall, it is a collaborative effect, and that companies are equally concerned about making sure that consumers are treated appropriately. Regulators ensure that through their activities as well. And I think we have a commonality of mission, and when we think of it in that context. So that's great. All right, well, Tate, let's go through a couple of the tools that regulators might use to assess the marketplace. We've got a few items on here: market analysis, data calls, continuums, examinations, reach outs. Bear in mind that for many in our audience, they've not had any familiarity with any of these terms. Could you take a few moments to just share your thoughts on each of these different types of regulatory tools?
Sure, happy to. So when we talk about market analysis, to kind of boil it down, everything usually starts with what we call a level one. And so when we identify a company that potentially may have issues, we start with a level one, and we use what's called eyesight, and that's through the NAIC, and they compile a wide variety of data across financial, market, legal, all sorts of areas. And so we use that analysis process to determine if there are any concerns with a particular company. And if there are, then we sort of proceed to the next step. And that's where these other items come into play. So a data call can be a variety of things. Sometimes it's company specific. Maybe we want to look at claims for a given period because we're seeing complaints, for example, with a given company. It could be something more broad where we're writing to, let's say, our top 20 health carriers and asking for data on, a certain procedure. Maybe it's a colonoscopy or something like that to determine if there are any concerns. So that can be a variety of things. Sometimes it is company specific. Other times it can be much more broad. Continuum, this is still a word that's kind of funny to me when I see it. I mean, basically it's sort of the continuum of regulatory responses is what it is. And that's a variety of things. So after we do analysis, we'll sort of look at, okay, what's the next step? And a continuum can be anything from an inquiry to interrogatories to even a data call could fit into that space. So it's sort of just a term that means some sort of more formal outreach, but stopping short of an exam. And then obviously an examination is a more formal process. That's where you actually use your state's exam authority to call one. And it's a much more prescribed process. There are timelines, there are requirements. In our state, for example, once the exam's finalized, we are required to have a final order and an exam report, even if there are no findings. So some states, I think, have more flexibility there, but for us, it's definitely a much more formal process. Mm-hmm. Reach out is more informal. And I think Mary can attest to this. There's been a few times where I've reached out to her based on, consumer complaint. And since she's somebody that generally, is honest with me, I feel comfortable doing that. Other companies, I probably wouldn't go that route because it wouldn't be productive. But I have done that where I'm like, I don't know that this warrants sending an inquiry, waiting 15 to 20 days for a response and going from there. So that's a much more informal process. And to your point earlier, it's really something that happens a lot if regulators feel comfortable, if they know the company person, the personnel. It's a process that generally can get results quickly if it's an issue that you feel like can be resolved in that way.
And Tate, just a quick comment that I would make based upon what you just said, and that is that for those in the audience, establishing a sound relationship with regulators is a very productive thing to do. In other words, I would urge you to get to know as many regulators as possible. They have an important job to do, like we've talked about. I think they're interested in making sure that your company complies with applicable laws and regulations, and that's your job as well. So you have a commonality of interest there. And as Tate indicated, I mean, he has trust in Mary, feels comfortable reaching out to her. And that's just based on the fact that they've established this working relationship, which can really be a positive. It can be a win-win for both parties. So just a quick thought there. So Tate, let's move on to the question of market analysis. You mentioned market analysis. This is a primary tool that is used through the NAIC to be able to assess the marketplace in given states. But ultimately, at the end of the day, that analysis is going to identify certain organizations who may, for one reason or another, require heightened scrutiny. And how does that process actually take place? And could you take a few moments to share your perspective on exactly how that market analysis process results in certain sort of steps we just described in the last slide?
Sure. So, the first bullet here, the market conduct annual statement. So for those of you who may not be aware, it's an annual data collection that the NAIC facilitates, and there's a variety of lines of business in addition to the normal ones you would expect, like homeowners and auto and life. There are ones that are added as needed. So more recent ones are things like lender-placed insurance and private flood. And so basically what happens is the NAIC compiles all of this data, and then the states will go in and start to sort of review it and see if they can identify outliers. So, if a company on a graph appears to be far above their competitors on, claim payment time or something like that, then you'll start to do a little more digging and see why. And there are times, frankly, where it's perfectly explainable. Obviously, if a company has, a total of 5 claims that are closed and 1 or 2 of them appear to be late, it may not be an issue. And so sometimes a smaller number can really skew the data. So I think most states try to have a common sense approach and not rush to any conclusions until they sort of see what the actual numbers look like. The baseline analysis tool will sort of look at complaints, MCAS, what are other states doing in terms of exam activity? Has there been a lot of growth in premium if a company, year over year has, $100,000 in the first year and 6 or 7 million in premium the next year? There's going to be some questions there. Again, it could be explainable. Maybe they've moved business from another one of their carriers, but it could also mean that, they're being really aggressive with their sales. And so we would want to know what exactly is happening there. RIARS is basically just the regulatory information retrieval system. So anytime a state initiates an action, for example, an order and a fine, it will go in there. That's obviously something we in most states pay attention to, just because it can warn us of possible issues. If a company's been fined a substantial amount in another state, then that's something that we would certainly look at and see if we have similar concerns in our jurisdiction. And also, when was the last exam done? What was the timing in terms of, how long did it take? Is it something that we feel was too recent for us to go in and do it? I mean, we try to be aware of what other states are doing, but that's not always easy. So, I think also collaboration is important. MATS is our tracking system, which basically anytime a state has an inquiry, an exam, whatever, they will put it in there. So that's something that we certainly pay attention to. It's relevant. MOG, which I believe we'll kind of talk about a little more in depth later, is the Market Actions Working Group. That's an interesting forum. It's regulator only. There are members of the group, but all of our jurisdictions participate. Even if they're not a member, you can bring concerns to MOG. So that's always informative because it is, as I said, regulator only. So regulators can sort of speak,
Yes,
confidentially.
absolutely.
They can bring possible issues to the forefront. So it's a really good tool that we find to be helpful. And there are times where it can lead to collaboration where it may make sense for a bunch of states to get together and do an action rather than 20 jurisdictions reaching out to a company separately.
Absolutely. And for our attendees, I will remind you, as we talked about yesterday, there's a lot of acronyms in the insurance business. And as you can see on this slide, we have quite a few of them. So again, the materials will be available after the conference, but you can perhaps attach your notes to be able to explain. And thank you very much for explaining RIARs, Tate. That was very helpful as well. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. And Mary, could you take a moment to just talk a little bit about, from a company perspective, what types of pieces of information that you're looking at in terms of providing to regulators as part of their review?
Yeah, and first, before I should probably make a statement that my comments are just my own personal comments, and they don't represent necessarily the opinions of Transamerica, but when we were talking initially and preparing for this, it's for today's presentation, one of the things that strikes me is that all the information that Tate just mentioned, we as companies have, for the most part, have all that same information. And so we should be looking at those things also. We have our market conduct annual statements. We know what the state ratios are, and we know where we fit in those state ratios, at least compared to, say, a prior year's ratio. We all should be monitoring our complaints. We know what exams we have going on. We don't have to check the exam tracking system, just to throw out I think that's ETS, I think, maybe, for if that's still around. We know what our premiums are. We know what those enforcement actions are. We don't even have to go to the RIARS database to get those. And we know we know what all the examinations and when our most recent comprehensive examination is. So we have all that same information, and we can be proactive ourselves with that same information.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an example of where, if your company has sound compliance systems in place, they'll be looking at this type of data in advance of when the regulators are looking at it, so you can be fully prepared and recognize if there are certain anomalies that would raise the attention of regulators, and you can be appropriately prepared to be able to respond to those types of requests. All right, let's move on to the next issue, which is really the question of data calls and interrogatories. And so I think, as we talked about this subject matter, Tate and Mary, I think my takeaway from this was that data calls or interrogatories should not always be deemed to be a sort of adverse events. In other words, it may be that regulators are simply asking these questions just to get a sense of the overall marketplace, and it may not pertain to a specific company. Tate, could you share your perspective on that question?
Sure. Yeah. And I think you kind of hit the high point there. And I kind of mentioned it earlier. We do a variety of data calls. Sometimes they are company specific, depending on, what issues we may see. Specifically, claims is an area that comes up very frequently, where unless we request the data, it's really hard to get a picture of what the numbers truly look like. So in terms of the more broad ones, and we haven't really done a lot in terms of COVID, just because the NEIC has been really active. We certainly have been watching the market, but we did one recently to our health carriers involving colonoscopies, for example. So if we see concerns and maybe consumer complaints, and it may not be necessarily that companies are doing anything that is in violation of the law. There could be some misunderstanding, and to the earlier point about consistency, we sort of just reached out and said, okay, here's some information we're looking for in terms of how you handle colonoscopies, and please give us this data so we can sort of compare side by side where the companies rank. And very quickly in those situations, you can tell if there are outliers, because the companies that generally seem to have, in that case, robust procedures and appear to be following the rules in terms of how they should handle those kind of claims, it becomes apparent quickly. The other ones that maybe don't have responses, they say NA, or their responses just aren't very detailed, it becomes apparent who you need to follow up with. And so we utilize those pretty regularly. But to your point, if I'm a company, I wouldn't necessarily read too much into a data call, because it could just be that we're surveying all the carriers in a given line of business in our marketplace. So it's something that we try to limit, but as issues come up and it's just apparent that it doesn't make sense to write to each company individually, we will utilize the data calls.
All right, very well. So we talked earlier about this concept of continuums. Could you talk a little bit about how that continuum might work?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note your first bullet point, where it really is coming from a place of, okay, what is the least invasive way we can do this? And obviously costs are a concern, but as a regulator, our primary concern is consumer protection. And being a small unit, I mean, there's really three of us and we touch all lines of business. And so we find that generally the continuums are the best approach, because we can really touch a lot of companies, where if we do exams, and we will do exams if it's sort of the only option after we've tried other avenues, but it's a very involved process. And so we really try to avoid that if possible. So it's important, as a side note, that companies are cooperative, because if we're not getting information or we're having to follow up repeatedly, we will sort of start to consider the exam approach if we don't feel like we're getting responsive information. So really, as I said earlier, the continuum is just a broad term, and it can encompass a lot of different things. And so, interrogatories, data calls, inquiries, all of those things fit. Sometimes, even if it's a conference call or something, I would put that in a continuum setting, just because, you're still reaching out to the company. It's not an exam, but you've determined that, additional correspondence is needed. So, to this bullet point here, the more informal route is where we like to begin, if at all possible. There are times where a phone call will clear up concerns we may have. It could just be a misunderstanding, and so we'll call it good. We don't always necessarily pursue the more formal route, but again, if that starting point doesn't work, if we feel like the company's just not being forthcoming, maybe not even responding to us, that does happen from time to time, we really don't have any other choice. And so we do have to go the more formal route. Now, again, when we do our exams, we don't ever do comprehensive exams. They're targeted. So we will try to identify what our areas of concern are and really hone in on that, just because, our goal is not to drag out that process. We want the exam to be as quick as possible. And again, some of that is out of our hands. If the company is understaffed, or they don't have the resources, or they're not devoting, frankly, the resources that they should be, then the process can really slow down. And so it's not fun for us, because then we have to sort of update our executive staff on why it's taking so long. And sometimes in those situations, people, higher up in the department may feel like they want to get involved to sort of reiterate to the company, you need to take this more seriously. So it really is in everyone's best interest to try to move that process as quickly as possible. So kind of going into the types of exams, as I mentioned, a comprehensive exam is just something we have not done in a long time. Some states do them on a regular basis. Some states do them occasionally if it's just apparent that a company has a lot of issues. It's very time consuming. I think you can just pretty much guarantee it will be at least a year before the process is wrapped up, because so much information is being reviewed. The targeted exam is what I sort of touched on. That's what we do, where we'll look at specific areas, complaints, for example, or claims or underwriting, but we typically don't look at issues outside of where we're seeing concerns, just because it doesn't seem like a good use of our time. We had a little bit of a discussion earlier on desk exams, and that's not really a term we use anymore. All of our exams, even before COVID, were done remotely for the most part. So I think before that was an important term because you would sort of designate in the NEIC system, it is a desk exam, meaning we're not going to be on site, but anymore, we don't really use that term, at least in Kansas. The multi-state process is something that typically originates in MOG, where it will be brought before the group, and sometimes it can be a company. The example here is the Death Master File, which involved dozens and dozens of companies, and I believe there's still a few outstanding Death Master File exams just because it's been such a long process. So that's a tool that, quite honestly, it can be beneficial to the company, believe it or not, because there are instances if a company has a lot of problems where it is better to have a multi-state exam where you can potentially get a settlement versus dozens of states individually coming in, doing separate exams, issuing separate orders and reports. So there are times where it probably is beneficial for the company to try to get their issues resolved through that multi-state route.
Mm-hmm.
The re-exams are sometimes a tool a state will use if they feel like a company has issues that they want to go and check up on. If a company, for example, enters into a corrective action plan and a state wants to go in and retest to make sure that the company has followed the corrective action plan and has no future issues, that's a tool that states will use. And then the data-driven exams, quite honestly, I can't really speak to. I'm familiar with them, but it's just not something we typically do. We don't, do exams on things like premium tax, so it's not really a thing for Kansas, at least.
All right, very well. Well, then, once the exam process is, determined, can you talk a little bit about what the next steps in that process may be?
Sure. So as I alluded to earlier, in Kansas, at least, our exam is sort of our last resort just because it is such a formal process. So once we identify a company, the commissioner will sign what's known as a call letter that goes out to the company. We do provide 60 days notice. In all practicality, there is the option to do what's known as a no-knock exam, which is basically if you are so concerned that the company will be destroying records or not be responsive, you could show up. Fortunately, we've never had to do that, but it is an option if we feel like the company is potentially going to be destroying evidence, for example. So we will also request the exam coordinator's contact information, not only for data requests and the various responses that will come to the company, but also for housekeeping items like billing. So in our state, we bill for our time and benefits. So it's important early on to establish who that person is. So in terms of the pre-exam preparation, we will draft interrogatories for the company to answer, and that will cover a variety of issues like company history, an overview of how it's structured, how the various department works, things like that, and then sort of request a variety of materials that we think will be responsive to help in our review, and that will include things like policies and procedures, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll create what are called SDRs, standardized data requests. And so the NEIC in the Market Regulation Handbook has these data requests, and they're very helpful, particularly for us smaller states, because we can go in there and instead of reinventing the wheel, sort of pick and choose what data elements we think would be helpful. And that will cover things like claims or underwriting or sales and marketing material, things like that. And then we'll sort of go from there and create our samples of the files we want to review. And then really we have our what we call our kickoff call, and that is just basically where we sort of introduce ourselves, figure out who in the company will be involved, and basically that meeting just has a really high-level overview of our process and our expectations. And I think it's important because it really gives the company a chance to ask us questions. I think sometimes it can be intimidating getting this formal letter, and so it's important to sort of establish the fact that we're a state that generally encourages cooperation and certainly welcomes outreach. If a company is early on identifying issues, we always recommend that they self-report that as quickly as possible, because generally we'll probably figure out through our review that there are issues. So if a company is aware of problems, it's always better to sort of level set and let us know ahead of time. We take that into consideration when we go down the road to formulate what the recommendations are.
Okay, very well. So you provide notice to the examining company. There is preparation that is done prior to the exam, and now you're about to conduct the exam. There are two acronyms here, Tate, I'd like you to talk about, the IRs and the CRITs. What are they?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I know states have different terminology. We don't actually use these terms, but I mean, they're all sort of covering the same thing. So the IRs are the information requests. And in Kansas, we would also probably include inquiries in there, but we call them requests for information. So
Okay.
as we start to look through the information, if there might be some pieces that are missing, and it may not be on purpose, but if, for example, we ask for certain procedures and maybe we got a really high level overview, but there wasn't sort of the detail we wanted, we would send a request for information. You know, an inquiry could happen if we're reading through, for example, a company's external audit reports, and maybe it says, hey, this is a repeat finding. We would probably send an inquiry and ask, okay, what have you done to address these deficiencies? So the crits, and again, we call them violations, but it's the same idea. So if we're doing a claim review, for example, and we identify, you know, claims that were paid beyond 30 days, then we will start to write those up as violations. And then we cite the applicable statute or regulation we feel has been violated. So typically our response time is 5 business days. So we allow the company that time to formalize, you know, some sort of request or a response to us. So we try to be flexible in those situations. When we send our data calls, for example, we typically give 30 days, but if we send a request for information that's particularly lengthy, you know, we'll try to be understanding, because 5 business days can be a tight turnaround time. And we're aware, and I'm sure Mary can speak to this, that, you know, there are often internal turnaround times. So if a state says, well, we want the information within 5 business days, sometimes internally the company may say, well, you need to circulate this within 3. So it can be a tight turnaround time, and we try to work with companies, but we also recommend early on that if you know you're going to need more information internally, that you have to go get to request an extension early on if possible. If it becomes a pattern where, you know, every time we send it on the 5th business day at 4:59, the company says, oh, by the way, we need more time, obviously we're going to be a little less sympathetic, and so we certainly don't like when companies make a habit of it, for sure. But
Okay.
once the exit conference occurs, and you know, like I said, even before COVID, this was all done remotely. So we'll have a teleconference, and we just sort of summarize our findings, because I think it's helpful to make sure that everyone is on the same page and say, you know, we believe that these are the violations. And also, our reports will often have recommendations where it may not be a specific violation of our law, but we feel like it's something that should be addressed. So if a company has maybe inadequacies on the policyholder service side, we'll make recommendations. Nothing, you know, I would say requires the company to adhere to that and to make those changes. But if a company is receptive, if they say, look, here's our plan to fix these recommendations and to fully address them, that's certainly an extenuating circumstance, and we will take that into account when we look at the order and potential penalties down the road. So the final report, as I mentioned earlier, it's always on our website 30 days after everything's been finalized. We always have an order. Again, even if there is no fine, if we have no substantial findings, we still have to have an order and a report. So that's always made public. If there is a corrective action plan, that typically will be included. There is some negotiation there. There's also, it's based, I think, on company preference, but there is also some negotiation in terms of if a company wants to have like a formal response letter on the record to a report, we will consider that. Sometimes if a corrective action plan contains more sensitive information or even proprietary type information, we try to be mindful of that. And if we can, you know, not include that information because it is public, we will certainly do that. And then ultimately there's an order. Typically in our case, it's a consent order. There have been a few instances where it was a summary order just based on the company cooperation level, but we do try to make it a consent order so the company has some input into the process. And, you know, that basically memorializes everything that's happened in the agreement. And so I mean, the last avenue for a company, if they truly don't agree with many or all of the findings, they can request a hearing. That's exceedingly rare just because it really isn't beneficial to either side, but companies are certainly welcome to do it. We have had a few times where we've proceeded down that road, and then at the last minute, we were able to sort of hammer out a compromise and avoid that process just because, like I said, it's not something we really think is beneficial, but again, it is an option for a company, and typically those are done in-house by our assistant commissioner. But like I said, those are pretty rare.
Okay. All right. Very well. All right, so let's just review. We'll go through these slides a little quickly here, but we just want to alert our attendees that these are the types of items that might be reviewed during an examination. So certainly complaints would be a subject matter, claims, as I think Tate pointed out earlier, the underwriting processes, the extent to which replacements and surrenders and cancellations take place, sales, advertising, and marketing materials, like we suggested in our discussion of advertising review yesterday. And then also the broader operation of the company as a whole, their management, how do they go about overseeing and supervising their business processes, issues that potentially may be associated with agency or producer licensing, and even in some cases taxes as well. So you can see it's a fairly broad range of subject matters. Our next slide talks a little bit about multi-state examinations. And Tate, if you could take a moment and just talk a little bit about, you referenced it earlier, the Market Actions Working Group. For those that are not regulators, this kind of happens in behind the curtain, if you will. Could you talk a little bit about that process and why that's really important from a regulatory perspective?
Sure. So, I mean, basically, MOG has monthly calls in addition to meetings that are typically held at the NEIC national meetings. And so it's a good forum for the chief market regulation people in different states to get together and collaborate. And so sometimes it can be very casual where a person may say, I just want to bring this company to your attention. We're early on in our review. We're not recommending any formal course of action, but put it on your radar. Other times there will be a formal request where a state says, we've identified problems. We think it impacts multiple jurisdictions. This is probably the best approach. And then they will recommend a multi-state action of some sort. So it's an important process. There are times where we will ask companies to appear before MOG and answer questions. And in some instances, it will resolve regulators' concerns. So it can be sort of a path of least resistance. And other times, and I don't know if you want me to speak to it now, Don, I think it's on another slide, about the times when companies will actually voluntarily appear before MOG.
Yes.
Do you want me to talk about that now, or?
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay. So, for example, if a company identified some widespread issues and it is trying to be proactive and self-report, it will reach out to MOG and ask for time to speak to the regulators. And it's sort of like ripping off the Band-Aid. It can be intimidating. I think some companies would not feel comfortable going that route, but really, if you're in front of an issue earlier in the process and you self-report and you say, yes, we know we have problems, we are working to correct it, oftentimes you will end up in a far better place starting in that direction than if you just sort of bury your head in the sand and hope states don't find out, because it may take time, but states will eventually find out. And if it is a widespread problem, guess what? They'll probably bring it before MOG, and instead of maybe being able to work out a corrective action plan, you're looking at potentially a multi-state exam, which is much more involved and costly. So it certainly makes sense in those situations for companies to come forward and say, hey, can we speak before MOG, to sort of let you know not only what the problems are, but what we are doing to address them.
Excellent. Okay, very good. Well, I think there's really two key takeaways I'd like everyone to take out of this discussion on these issues, and that is, number one, it should come as no surprise that states talk to one another and they work together. And so this concept of a multi-state examination does exist. Usually there is a lead state that is identified as part of that process. And so the inquiry from one state actually may represent multiple states if indeed it is a multi-state exam. Well, let's talk a little bit about reach outs here. I guess maybe the the point we want to make here is that we think today's event is indicative of what compliance professionals should be doing, and that is periodically educating themselves and improving their overall professional expertise. And they could do that in a variety of different ways through, continuing education, collaboration with peers, which we think is very important at CFTC. And then also, as we talked a little bit about earlier, maintaining your contacts throughout the industry and also with regulators as well. So I thought we might take a few moments to talk a little bit about some common issues that were found in recent examinations, and I'll go through these fairly promptly. We have worked closely with some of our affiliate member organizations who track this information closely and do appropriate analyses. And so here are some examples of issues that have been identified recently, just to give you a flavor of the types of issues that might arise in a market conduct exam. So with respect to marketing and sales, failure to identify the insurer or the agents or the agency selling the product. We saw that yesterday in Carla's session with regard to advertising review. Inappropriate replacements, a non-compliant buyer's guide, failure to disclose the source of statistics in ads. With regard to training, failure to adequately train agents. Policyholder service, failure to timely send policyholder statements. Underwriting, using unfiled or unapproved forms. Claims, failure to provide claim forms to beneficiaries. Failure to maintain adequate DMF cross-checks. We talked about that earlier. Again, this pertains to the death master file that is maintained by the Social Security Administration, and companies are required to conduct those types of checks. So those are examples of some things that have happened on recent exams. Just a couple of items that we think are on the radar, at least through the work of the A committee at the NAIC. The A committee is the Life Insurance and Annuities Committee. And so some of the issues they're looking at include accelerated underwriting and the use of AI, artificial intelligence, in accelerated underwriting by life insurance companies. Annuity disclosures, annuity suitability, which we'll talk about in our next session in just a few moments. Life insurance illustrations and life insurance policy locator services practices as well. So that gives you an indication as to kind of some of the issues that are certainly on the horizon for regulators over the months ahead. So let's shift gears and let's look at this entire question from a company perspective. And Mary, if you could take a few moments to just talk a little bit about what happens after you receive the exam notice.
Yes. So the first thing I do when I become aware of an examination notice is I have my team pull and start looking at some of the internal data that we have that I believe the state may have been looking at, like our complaints and our MCAS data. And once I have that information, I'll pick up the phone and I will call the state's contact. And it's my opportunity to ask some questions: who, what, when, where, how, and why. And apparently I thought why was so important. I've got it as 2 bullet points on this slide, like why is this exam been called? And sometimes I receive a very thoughtful response from the regulator when I ask that question. They talk about, they're able to look at specific or point me to specific ratios in MCAS or specific information about complaints trends they've identified. Sometimes I just get a response that says, well, your complaints must be up. And if I've already looked at the data, I'm like, well, no, actually our complaints have trended down over the last, 2 years or 3 years, something like that. So you get different responses, but at the minimum, you've started this communication that you need to think about through this whole process. It's communicate.
Mm-hmm.
And during that call, Tate mentioned that they like to start with continuum type things that are less invasive. I will always try. I shouldn't say sometimes. I will always try to see if there's something less invasive that we might be able to work out rather than an examination. I'm maybe not successful very often, but often if you're dealing with a regulator who you're able to explain, like, there's this specific problem and let me tell you what we're doing to address it, you can perhaps move it from an examination to a continuum. It's also an opportunity to narrow the scope, which is really good. The kinds of material that Tate's described about, the types of exams and that type of thing. It's also your opportunity to just start some of that, and to also talk about the importance of information security, the need to use, secure file transfer portals to transmit your data. It's not on the slides, but something I should have put on the slides was most states, not all states, but most states have an examination work paper confidentiality in their statutes. It's in the model, it's in the NAIC model. Not all states have adopted that portion of it, but I tend to mark everything I give the regulator as a confidential examination work paper, and I cite the statute. It's in email communications, it's in memos, if we have sufficient time, I will mark, policyholder and claim records, even to include that disclosure. Let's see. Again, it's those questions were the who, what, when, where, how, why questions. We'll do some investigation just so we know I don't want to say what we're up against, but to understand what could be occurring in the future to us. We look at the website, the department's website, check exam reports, check enforcement penalties. That helps you understand like what might be a hot topic for that particular regulator. I always consider, and different companies domiciled in different states may have different perspectives, but I always would suggest you consider contacting your domestic regulator and giving them a heads up. Chances are they're aware of it through other communications, through the NAIC, through different bulletin boards and things of that nature. But it's something I would consider doing. Frankly, my companies, other than our New York company, are domiciled in Iowa, and I always just pick up the phone and I let Iowa know. I would also suggest consider potentially retaining local counsel in that jurisdiction. I don't always use local counsel. Most of the time I try to avoid it, but sometimes it's good to have someone who's local on the ground who can kind of tell you the lay of the land. And if a question arises during the examination, you can seek that legal advice if you need it. IT is for us, it's a big it's a big rock for us. I'll just put it like that. You need to inform your leadership, you need to inform your key stakeholders, and IT is one of your biggest stakeholders that you need to reach out to immediately. Kate mentioned they provide about 30 days for those data files to get pulled together. I can only speak for my company, but I suspect there are multiple companies in similar situations. We have in excess of 30 legacy systems. So that means programming for 30 legacy systems who all have a date someplace else in each of those systems. So we work towards, number one, we pull those IT people together, and we identify any questions that we may have. It should be pretty standard because, as Tate mentioned, there's the standard data requests out there, but occasionally somebody tweaks something and we just want to make sure we're on the same page. We actually will develop a file layout, and we will share that with the regulator, and we ask the regulator to review it and approve it before we begin our programming, so that we actually do capture all the information the regulators requested. Some of the things we do in the background are the data mapping. that I have a bullet point on there on, and that's again because we have so many systems. We want to just make sure everything gets mapped correctly to the file layout. And you may want to have, and a lot of times regulators would like to have a meeting with your IT folks. I don't particularly care to have that occur because again, I have 30 different experts and I don't want to have a call that's that large. And I mean, in my experience, some of my programmers or coders, they're very literal, and they're asking like, well, what about this field on my system? And I don't think Tate
Right.
wants to go through that.
Right. Thank you, Mary. I'll speak for Tate. You know, and Mary, I think one of the keys here, I think, that in terms of an overriding message is that, you know, keep in mind your request is only one of several at the company. In other words, you got to get your place in line, and so you really do need to reach out to IT, make sure they're fully informed as to what's going on, and they're aware of the timeframes that you're working with. In some cases, can be pretty tight, and there's a significant competition for IT resources. I suspect I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know, but that is a key element.
It is key, and I would say I feel very lucky that my management recognizes any regulatory request as the highest priority, but sometimes all those regulatory requests create that competition for those resources.
Sure. Absolutely. So Mary, I guess another part of the process is you're selecting an exam coordinator, and that may very well be you at Transamerica. And then your job is basically to make sure that the exam goes smoothly, to reduce the time frames. That in turn reduces potential costs, and make sure that everything is accurate and organized and provided in a timely manner. Correct?
That's the high priority is finding the right person. And I'm happy to say I don't actually coordinate anymore. But,
oh, wonderful.
But it's an important role. And as I like to tell people, the role of that coordinator is to make sure Tate can do his job. I mean,
Yes. Good point, Mary.
That's the role of that person, is to make sure Tate or his peers can do their job. Like their job is to help Tate do his job.
Good point, Mary. Excellent. Excellent. So I guess then there are tracking procedures to identify all of the various examination requests. I think you've indicated the requests go through the coordinator, and then you meet regularly with the examiner in charge or the exam team to review status.
I think it's back to my earlier comment about communicate. Make sure that everyone's on the same page, set your priorities. Sometimes we meet weekly, sometimes we meet bi-weekly. Sometimes we maybe meet with the examiner in charge and like their key person every week, and then meet with the entire exam team and the company's entire team, you know, bi-weekly. But set up some type of cadence so that you are communicating constantly.
Indeed. Well, and then I guess, you know, as the responses are being developed by the company, obviously they undergo review internally, make sure that you have an appropriate solution to the question that's been identified. Mary, you indicated communicating is really key. We understand that. Another key component, Mary, I think is understanding the applicable law that may be the subject of a potential area of scrutiny or a potential violation. Could you comment a little bit about these two bullet points? In other words, don't assume the regulators know the law, and don't assume you know the law.
Right. So I don't think this is the case in Tate's situation with the state of Kansas, but some regulators use outside firms, third-party firms, to perform their examinations, and they may have been examining for, you know, state A on, you know, last week, and this week they're examining for state B, or maybe they are even juggling multiple exams simultaneously. You just can't assume that they really know the law. So always pull it, review it with your inside counsel if you need to review it with your inside counsel. And again, that might be an opportunity if you have a question where you might want to, you know, review the law with outside counsel too.
Sure. And Mary, could you talk a little bit about this? Obviously, I would assume would be a great rarity, but what if an examiner violates company policy? How is that generally handled?
So, and first off, you're absolutely correct, Don. I've only really had this happen significantly one time in my 25 plus years of being on this side of the of an examination process. And what my advice to companies to do is to follow the same procedure you have if it were an employee who violated a company policy. In the case the kind of egregious case I had, it was an agent who was figured out a way to get around our firewall. This is early on, many years ago. We're much more savvy now on IT, but they were getting around our firewall and getting to pornography sites. And it, of course, set off red bells and whistles and everything down at, in the data center. So just treat it like have an investigation performed just like you would if it were an employee. And then in that particular case, I tried very hard to make sure information was hand delivered, to the chief examiner at the department, so that we kept maintaining the confidentiality of the issue.
Okay, very well. Well, in the interest of time, let me review some of the other elements here, and that is that there is a closing conference that takes place, and you should inquire as to whether there is an appeal process, and I believe Tate alluded to that earlier in terms of a possible administrative hearing, and also ask for input as to what you can do better as a company. And then you will receive the draft examination report. It's a public record, but it is important that it be reviewed carefully. And then to make sure that the recommendations that are offered as a part of a corrective action plan are indeed implemented and tested and assured on a regular basis, because as Tate noted, one of the examination processes is the fact to go back and review companies' plans of corrective action to see that they were implemented appropriately. So I'd like to take in the last few minutes we have here a few final thoughts. And the first item we listed here in our discussion was providing adequate work facilities for the examiners to do their jobs. And Mary, you want to comment about this issue?
Sure. There will be times where you will be pushed, at least I've had this experience with different, say, locations in our company where someone has suggested we put the examiners in the basement with, basically a piece of plywood and some sawhorses for a desk. That's not the right thing to do. It doesn't allow Tate or his people to do their job. And again, your job is to make sure he can do his job. Sure. So get him adequate and appropriate workspace.
Yep. And Tate, have you had experiences in which you were given less than adequate workspaces?
Not directly, but prior to when I came to the department, I'd heard some stories internally. My favorite was people being put into a strip mall that a company owned and getting walk-in traffic because they thought it was the tanning salon or whatever used to be there. So it was interesting because you can see the building, but you're away from it, and so read into that what you will. You can't obviously write that up, but it sort of speaks to your perception of how the company treats you and what they think of you.
Exactly.
Or what they think of regulators, just in general.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's unfortunate. We shouldn't be painting with a broad brush here. Well, a couple of other key points. An exam doesn't have to be adversarial. I think we all agree, and certainly communication, as we've talked about, is essential for that purpose. If there is a meeting at the department, please don't bring an army of lawyers with you. That's generally not well received. But identify the 2-3 people that may be necessary for the meeting, and that comes up all the time. And again, we talked about communicate, really critical issues. And then also, there are going to be instances in which examiners are going to have limited access to systems to provide off-site work. Just review those questions, come up with a strategy that's going to work for your team, make sure that the examiners know how to access this information, and bear in mind that there may be other laws that will limit the types of information that need to be provided. HIPAA comes to mind immediately. And then as you're going through the exam process, don't call the department trying to fishing for answers to key questions or as to why they want to examine a particular area. Work with the examiner in charge, the EIC. And then if you feel you need to appeal to the department directly, let the EIC know. That's just good practice. And a couple of thoughts with regard to possible impediments to timely completion of exams. Make sure your data is accurate. Really important. Wrong data is going to extend the duration of your exam. And always try to clarify with the department what they are seeking. Don't arrive at your own judgments and assume what they are seeking in their examination processes. And then also, again, this broader issue of reviewing all responses for completeness and accuracy prior to submitting them. And as I think Kate may have noted, there are opportunities to request for extensions. So if you need one, ask for one. And more often than not, they will be granted. So we've come to the close of our session. We have just a few moments, perhaps, if there might be any questions that anyone might have, please go right ahead and submit them. We'll give you a few moments here. All right, I'm seeing an indication that we haven't had any questions thus far. Let's give you 15 more seconds.
I promise I won't write your name down.
Thank you, Tate.